Legends in the dust. The winds over Vetrax Prime carried more dust than truth. Kale stood at the edge of the Scholar's Tower, his four eyes scanning the skyline of shimmering crystal spires. Below, the city pulsed with the rhythm of civilization that believed it had mastered everything worth knowing, except the myths. He turned the fragile page of an ancient tome, one he'd salvaged from a crumbling archive in the outer Dustlands. Its text spoke of creatures long dismissed as fantasy. Humans. Bipedal. Carbon-based. Violent. Unrelenting. "They're not real, Kale," scoffed Archivist Lurez as she glided past him, her voice thick with condescension. Stories the warlords told to scare hatchlings. The council purged those texts for a reason. Kale didn't argue. He simply traced the sketch burned into the vellum. A humanoid form wrapped in ancient armor. Eyes like twin stars, fire blooming behind them. But fire could be forgotten. He looked up again. The stars shimmered in perfect symmetry. Controlled. Known. And yet, a whisper gnawed at the edge of his mind. Something about the way the myths always ended. And then the stars fell silent. That night, silence screamed. The planetary grid trembled. Every sky lens across the city blinked out at once. Kale was jolted from sleep by the shriek of the planetary alert system, something that hadn't sounded in over 1,000 cycles. He scrambled to his window. Above the city, the sky had torn open. A shadow darker than void moved across the heavens. Not a ship, a fleet. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Perfectly spaced, no Vetrax signature. They hovered, silent and cold, eclipsing the moons with military precision. Across the city, energy shields flickered to life. Anti-orbital batteries groaned, ancient and barely maintained. Kale's breath caught. He ran to the communication console embedded in his wall. Dead. All of it. Static. Then a voice. It didn't come from the console, but from everywhere. A signal forced on every frequency. Harsh. Low. The language wasn't Vetrax, but the meaning sliced through universal translation like a blade through silk. "This is Admiral Luke Reyes of the Terran Fleet. We have not forgotten. We have not forgiven. Your sky now belongs to us." The message ended. The silence returned. Kale dropped to his knees, his heart's thundering. It couldn't be real. The myths were ashes. Fantasies. Folktales. Weren't they? But above, the fleet shifted formation with terrifying grace. No demands. No negotiations. No grand declarations of war. Just presence. And suddenly, all Kale could think of was a line from the old story. The one his mentors mocked him for quoting. "When the stars go quiet, listen for their boots." Contact lost. The skies remained black. Not the black of night or space, but something heavier. Intentional. It was as if the stars themselves had turned their backs on Vetrax. Kale stood in the middle of the Scholar's Tower courtyard, surrounded by panicked scholars and silent sentries. The broadcast from the Terran Admiral still rang in his ears. Not forgotten. Not forgiven. He tried again to access the central archives. Still nothing. Every frequency jammed. Every channel dead. The council had gone silent. That alone terrified him more than the fleet. "They're testing us," muttered Scholar Lurez, her voice stripped of confidence now. "It's a bluff. A technological spectacle." Kale turned to her, feeling something shift deep in his chest. "You heard the voice. That was no bluff. That was a warning." A pulse echoed overhead. Slow. Measured. He looked up. The largest vessel, an obsidian dagger blotting out the eastern moon, shimmered with energy. Small streaks of light fell from it like tears of fire. A dozen? No more. Missiles? No. Too slow. Dropships. The shields around the city flared, then dimmed. Not shattered, not destroyed, disabled. Surgical. Precise. Within minutes, entire districts lost power. The archives, the Hall of Memory, even the Sky Bridge, all dark. But still no explosions. No screams. Just silence. Kale pushed through the crowd toward the base of the tower. He had to see it for himself. He had to know. The city below was still intact. Buildings untouched. The streets glowed with emergency lights. Families fled underground shelters. Sentries scrambled like insects beneath a glass. But the invaders didn't fire. They watched, and that made it worse. He reached the observation deck. From here, he could see the full curvature of Vetrax Prime's atmosphere, and the fleet that now wrapped around it like a noose. A hand rested on his shoulder. Elder Mara. Her voice came slow and grave. The myths were warnings, Kale, not fantasies. He turned to her. You knew. She nodded painfully. Before I was a scholar, I served on the council. I saw the sealed records. The First Contact War. We started it. We thought humanity weak. Primitive. Kale swallowed hard. What happened? Mara looked up, eyes glistening. We underestimated their will to survive. Another signal burst across the skies. This time visual. A projection, hanging above the capital like a ghost. It showed grainy footage, human colonies burning. Vetrax warships firing on unarmed transports. Children in oxygen suits clutching toys as they suffocated in space. Unedited, unforgiving. The final frame was a line of Vetrax soldiers laughing over a pile of human bodies. No words followed. None were needed. The projection vanished. The guilt was no longer hidden in archives. It was smeared across the heavens for all to see. Kale's legs buckled. He leaned on the railing, gasping. He had read the rumors, the whispers, but the truth struck harder than any orbital blast. Mara spoke again, barely a whisper. They've come not to destroy us, but to show us who we were. And maybe who we still are. Kale stared up at the massive Terran vessel. Its hull bore no insignia, no color, just dark metal and memory. The myths had walked out of the storybooks and into their skies, and they had brought the past with them. Echoes of fire. The first strike came with no sound. From the upper atmosphere, Kale watched as a white-hot beam sliced cleanly through the Vetrax high communications array, an enormous spire once thought untouchable, hovering above the capital like a crown. It fell in eerie silence, its glowing fragments scattering like stardust. Not a single civilian was harmed, but everyone heard the message. They could strike anywhere, at any time, and they would choose not to kill. That terrified Kale more than any orbital bombardment. The precision, Scholar Lurez muttered beside him, her voice hollow. They're not attacking. They're editing us. Kale didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the horizon. The Terran Fleet hadn't moved since the warning broadcast. It loomed still and patient, like a predator that had already caught its prey and was waiting for it to understand. In the council chamber, chaos reigned. Panicked voices shouted over each other. Old generals barked demands to retaliate. Young ones froze. No orders came from the upper echelons. The planetary leadership, the same council that once silenced stories of humans, now sat silent, hidden, or gone. They're dismantling our civilization, said Elder Mara, still composed, still watching. Piece by piece. Erasing the machinery, not the people. They want us to feel it. Kale's fists clenched. They had once laughed at his obsession with human myths, called him naive, romantic. Now he was the only one who had even tried to understand them. He turned from the window and ran, through the halls of the tower, down into the lower archive levels. The power flickered as he reached the sealed wing, a place long ignored by scholars drunk on certainty. Inside, cold lights flickered on. Ancient data crystals lined the shelves, each tagged with red warnings, censored by council decree. Kale scanned the first he could reach, hands trembling. Images filled the air. Old records, battle logs, Vetrax fleets overwhelming primitive human colonies, slaughtering settlers who had never fired a shot. For every victory, there were atrocities. They called it the cleansing. Another file opened. A broadcast. A human woman, wounded and furious, stood in front of a shattered moon. We gave you peace. You gave us silence. We begged. You burned. Now we remember. The screen cut to black. Kale slumped against the console, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't an invasion. It was memory made manifest. He stumbled out into the night air. The streets were quiet now. Civilians huddled in temples, schools, and shadowed corners, afraid not of death, but of reckoning. The ground trembled again. A new strike. This time, the military archive tower, obliterated from orbit. No fire, no explosion, just vaporized. All strategic knowledge gone in a heartbeat. Yet, once again, not a single life lost. They were burning the Empire's legacy, not its people. Kale whispered to himself, the words of the myth now achingly real. When they return, they will not shout. They will not scream. They will simply show you what you made them become. In the distance, a child cried. Above, the Terran Fleet drifted in silence. And Vetrax, for the first time in 1,000 years, had no idea what would happen next. The war they forgot. The door to the Forbidden Archive groaned as Kale forced it open. He had no authorization. What did that mean anymore? The fleet above Vetrax had made such things obsolete. The sky was no longer theirs. Neither were their lies. Dust clung to every surface inside. The air was thick with silence, the kind that builds over centuries, waiting to be broken. Kale approached the central console, fingers trembling. This room had been sealed since long before he was born. Only council members had access. Not even Elder Mara had seen the full contents. He entered the override code he had stolen from her private terminal. The terminal flickered to life. Rows of files unspooled. Marked top-level black, Operation, Veilwalker. His breath caught. These weren't myths. They were records. Real, dated, sourced, authenticated. He opened the first. Initial contact with the Human Confederacy, cycle April 7th, 2201. Images flooded the air. Humans standing on dust-red soil, smiling, offering crystalline containers of water to Vetrax diplomats. Not warriors, not monsters, just people. A log accompanied it. Initial assessment, Terran species peaceful, technologically inferior, but culturally rich. Recommend observation. Next file. Then another. The tone shifted. Council directive. Expansion of Sector Theta requires removal of Terran presence. Negotiations deemed inefficient. Begin planetary cleansing. Kale's hearts pounded. Video feeds followed. Atrocities, not warfare. Human settlements bombed without warning. Civilians dragged from shelters. Children screaming as fire fell from orbit. He stumbled back, while rising to his throat. The final report appeared in bold red. Terran species, presumed extinct. No survivors reported after final purge of System Epsilon. But the humans had survived. He now understood what the Terran fleet above was. Not an invasion force, an echo. A consequence. A slow rage bloomed in his chest. Not at the humans, but at his own people. How many generations have been raised believing humans were fictional? How many scholars like him have been laughed at, silenced, or punished for seeking the truth? And now the truth had come home, wrapped in steel and silence. Behind him, soft footsteps echoed. Elder Mara entered, her expression unreadable. She had followed him, but made no move to stop him. You knew, Kale whispered, voice cracking. You all knew. Mara looked at the holos. Her eyes dimmed. Not all of it, only fragments. The council erased most of the war from our records. They said it was mercy. Mercy, Kale snapped. They lied. They buried guilt under arrogance and called it wisdom. She looked up at him slowly. Do you hate us now? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the final file, a message. It had no sender, just a timestamp, 20 cycles before the current date. Somehow, it had bypassed the network filters and settled here in the Black Vault. It was short, a human voice, female, calm, firm. We are not here to destroy you. We're here to remind you that history doesn't die when it's buried. It waits, and one day it rises. Kale stared at the message long after it ended. Mara's voice came again, barely above a whisper. What will you do now? Kale turned to her, and for the first time since the sky had gone dark, he spoke with certainty. I'm going to send a message to them. If there's any chance they'll listen, it starts with truth. And above them, the Terran fleet waited, not as conquerors, but as witnesses. In the shadow of Earth, Admiral Luke Reyes stood at the command deck's forward viewport, hands clasped behind his back, watching the planet spin below. Vetrax Prime. It looked peaceful, too peaceful. Soft clouds swept across glittering cities, the same cities where his ancestors had burned. He had studied the images all his life, his great-grandmother, barely 16, cradling her little brother as Vetrax plasma bombs fell on New Kyoto. There had been no war declaration, no mercy, no survivors from that colony, just silence. For centuries, Earth had grieved in the dark, but humanity hadn't died. It had evolved. "Sir," came a voice behind him. "The orbital grid is fully neutralized. All military communications remain jammed. Civilian life support systems are untouched. Casualties, 0, sir. Not a single confirmed death. Per your orders." Reyes nodded slowly, eyes never leaving the surface. Good. They hadn't come to annihilate, but he also hadn't come to forgive. The doors behind him slid open. Commander Juno Lask, his second-in-command, stepped forward, datapad in hand. "We've decrypted a message," she said. Came from the planetary surface. Encoded in an ancient Vetrax dialect, routed through a forgotten archive system. Reyes turned to her. "Someone's reaching out?" "Yes, sir. Not from the Council. A scholar. Civilian. Says he knows the truth about the war." He took the datapad, reading the translated message in silence. It was raw, honest, full of trembling regret. The scholar, Kale, admitted he'd believed the myths, that he had only recently uncovered what had been done. He begged to speak, not for politics, but for understanding. Reyes set the pad down. "They'd buried their shame," he muttered. "And now it's rising to meet them." Juno folded her arms. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" He nodded. "What exactly are we doing here, Luke? We've crippled their defenses. We've humiliated their leaders. You could have turned the entire capital to ash in the first hour. Why hold back?" Reyes was silent for a long moment. Then, "Because I remember what it feels like to be powerless, to scream into the dark and get nothing back." He turned toward her fully now, his voice quieter. "My family survived, but just barely. I grew up with their stories, every one of them ending in silence. Not justice, not closure, just loss." He stepped closer to the viewport, lowering his voice. All of this, it isn't about revenge. It's about reminding the galaxy that humans don't vanish. We endure. We remember. We return. Outside, one of the Terran ships reoriented slightly. Non-threatening, but deliberate. A gesture. Juno watched it with him. "So what now?" she asked. "Do we answer the scholar's message?" Reyes paused, then nodded. "Patch him through. No encryption. Let the whole planet hear what truth sounds like." Juno hesitated. "And the Council? They'll listen eventually," he said. "Or they won't. Either way, this story isn't theirs anymore." He picked up the datapad again and whispered more to himself than to her. "They turned us into a myth. Let's remind them what humans really are." Above Vetrax Prime, the Terran Fleet began a shift, not for war, but for dialogue. And below, in the ruins of half-lies and erased sins, one voice waited for another to answer. Voice between worlds. The transmission arrived like a breath held too long. Kale sat alone in the lower archives, surrounded by ancient dust and flickering terminals. The holoscreen sparked once, twice, then stabilized. A human face appeared, sharp, weathered, commanding. Admiral Luke Reyes. Kale's breath caught. The man from the warning broadcast. The name etched into every corner of the fleet's legend. A ghost from humanity's rebirth. But this wasn't a declaration. There were no weapons, no threats. Just a man looking directly at him. "This is Admiral Reyes of the Terran Fleet," the voice said, low and even. "I've received your message, Scholar Kale. I'm listening." Kale swallowed hard. Thank you, Admiral. I never imagined you would reply." Reyes's expression didn't change. "Most of your leaders haven't reached out. You're the only one who tried." Kale nodded. "They're afraid, not just of your weapons, but of the truth, of what we did." For a moment, there was silence between them, bridged by centuries of blood and denial. Kale pressed on. "You asked us to remember. I've seen the records. The war. The erasure. They called it peace. It was genocide." Reyes's jaw tightened. "And what would you call this? Us hovering in your skies like a judgment." Kale didn't flinch. "Necessary." That, finally, seemed to make the Admiral pause. Kale leaned forward. You're not here to destroy us. I see that now. But your silence is louder than any bombardment. The fear, the precision, it's not punishment. It's a mirror. He drew a shaking breath. I don't speak for the council, but I will speak for myself. I'm sorry. I'm ashamed of what we buried, of what we became. And if there's any chance at restoring anything, it starts with that. Reyes studied him for a long time. Then he stepped closer to the camera, voice lower, almost tired. You know what the hardest part of surviving was, Kale? Kale shook his head. It wasn't the loss. It wasn't the war. It was waking up every day after it ended, wondering if it mattered, if anyone would ever know. He took a breath, the mask of the Admiral falling just a little. For centuries, Earth rebuilt in silence. We found strength, unity, but the wound never closed. And now that we've come back, I still don't know if healing is possible. Kale's voice cracked. It has to be. Reyes didn't smile, but something in his face softened. Then prove it. Kale blinked. Ow, tell the truth. Not just to me, but to your people. Rip the silence out of the ground and hold it to the light. If you do that, maybe there's something worth salvaging between us. The screen dimmed slightly. I'm opening a channel. Public. 10 minutes. Say what your council never had the courage to. Kale stared, heart pounding. You trust me to speak to both sides? Reyes leaned back, face unreadable once more. You wanted history to remember you. Here's your chance. The screen went dark. Kale sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, he rose, knees unsteady, and looked toward the surface terminal that would link him to the planet's public network. Outside, the Terran ships shimmered like waiting gods. And for the first time in 1,000 years, both sides were listening. A sky full of witnesses. Kale stood before the old planetary broadcast terminal, heart pounding like thunder in his chest. A single green light blinked. Live. Every screen across Vetrax, every speaker, every public channel. Listening. He exhaled slowly. My name is Kale, a scholar of history from the Tower of Thought. I'm not a counselor. I don't speak with power. I speak because I can no longer stay silent. He paused. The silence of space pressed against him. You've heard the myths. Stories of ancient monsters called humans, creatures of rage and ruin. We were told they vanished long ago. We were told they were just shadows. He leaned into the mic, voice firmer. They were real. They are real. And we killed them. Shock spread through the streets of Vetrax as the words hit every home, every heart. The archives hidden beneath the council chambers. I've seen them. I watched the old footage. We didn't defend ourselves. We invaded their worlds. We erased them from our records and called it peace. He closed his eyes, but they remembered. They endured. Kale's voice broke just slightly. And now they've returned. Not with fire, not with genocide, but with memory, precision, restraint. They took down our weapons, our pride, our lies, and left us alive to face what we did. He placed both hands on the console. I know many of you are afraid. I am too. But we can no longer live in the shell of denial. If there is any hope for peace, for redemption, we must begin with the truth. He looked directly into the lens. To Admiral Reyes and the people of Earth. I cannot undo what was done, but I offer you something we denied you, recognition. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry. He ended the transmission. No applause, no music, just the slow flicker of the broadcast light going dark. He stood there for a long time, unsure if the tremor in his limbs was fear or release. The city responded with silence. Not chaos, not rioting, grief. Elder Mara watched the broadcast from the high balconies of the tower. Her hands trembled. Around her, the council chamber erupted in panicked shouting. Accusations flew. Demands to arrest Kale. Demands to surrender. Demands to fight. But something in the room had cracked. A few counselors stood in stunned silence. Others wept. Mara rose and spoke for the first time in hours. You buried the truth so deep you thought it would rot. But it bloomed. The others turned to her aghast. You knew, one barked. You helped preserve those archives. She nodded. Because I knew this day would come. And better it come from one of us than from orbit. Far above, in the command deck of the TS Vindicator, Admiral Reyes stood watching the final seconds of Kale's speech. The silence after it ended was different now, less brittle. Commander Juno stepped beside him. "Well," she asked. Reyes didn't speak for a long moment. Then, "Simply begin Phase 2. Juno blinked. "Peace." Reyes gave a slight nod. "If they can face their truth, maybe we can face ours." On Vetrax, parents held their children tighter. Scholars unsealed ancient vaults, and warriors laid down weapons they hadn't yet drawn. The myth of humanity had ended. Now came the reckoning. The day the silence ended. 3 days passed. The sky over Vetrax remained filled with the silent, shimmering fleet of Earth. Not a single shot had been fired. No demands, no ultimatums. Just presence and watching. But the world beneath that sky had already changed. Where once the people had walked in the comfort of ignorance, now they moved through grief, through guilt, through a new, jarring awareness of who they really were in the eyes of history. Kale sat on the steps of the Tower of Thought, head tilted back to the sky, staring at the vast Terran vessels like they were stars that had come down to judge the living. The wind brushed across his face. Everything felt quiet now. Not the silence of repression, but something almost reverent. He didn't turn when footsteps approached. "I thought they'd leave," said Elder Mara, sitting beside him. "After your message. After the truth." "I thought so too," Kale said softly. "But they stayed. To listen." He nodded. The council was fractured. Half had resigned. The other half were now openly debating restitution, reparations, and the creation of a permanent historical tribunal. Some wanted to invite human diplomats. Others wanted to step down entirely. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the people had heard, that children were now asking about Earth not with fear, but curiosity, that students were writing essays titled, "Why We Forgot and Why We Must Remember." Everything was changing. A small, melodic chime rang in Kale's earpiece. He tapped it. "This is Kale," he said. A voice responded. "Calm. Familiar. Admiral Reyes here. We've received the Council's request to meet. I've reviewed your proposals and your broadcasts." Kale's breath caught. "Will you come?" "Not me," Reyes said. "Not yet. We've elected an envoy. Civilian. Scholar like you. Her name is Elena Haru, one of our historians." Kale smiled faintly. A historian to face a historian. She volunteered. Said it mattered that the first face Vetrax sees isn't another soldier. That peace has to look like something different than war. Kale nodded, emotions swelling in his throat. "She'll be welcome here. Safe." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Reyes said, more softly, "This isn't forgiveness, Kale. Not yet, but it's a start." The line clicked off. Kale lowered his hand and looked back up at the sky, tears in his eyes. Not from shame this time, but relief. "They're coming down," he whispered. Mara gave a shaky laugh. "They're trusting us." "No," Kale said. "They're giving us a chance to become trustworthy." Later that day, the first Terran vessel breached the cloud line in peaceful descent. No weapons. No war cries. Just a single ship bearing the mark of Earth's reborn confederacy, a symbol of memory and survival. Crowds gathered in the capital square. No one fled. No one screamed. They simply watched, quiet and humbled. When Elena Haru stepped onto Vetraxian soil, she bowed her head, not in surrender, but in mourning for what had been lost and in hope for what might still be found. Kale met her there, offering an open hand. She took it. In that moment, the myth finally died, and in its place, a story began. A story not of monsters or vengeance, but of two civilizations, once broken by silence, learning to speak and to listen again.